Ghanem is a hero of our age. This Egyptian young man, a Google executive, founded a Facebook page in 2010, and he called it "We Are All Khalid Said," referring to a young man who was tortured to death by the Egyptian police. From that Facebook page, he inspired and organized the revolution in Egypt that brought down Hosni Mubarak. In the early stages, he was arrested and held blindfolded in detention. Upon his release, Ghanem was greeted with joy by the crowds in Tahrir Square. Finally, on February 7th, Mubarak resigned, and the Egyptians planned for a great celebration 10 days later in Tahrir Square featuring Wael Ghanem. But on that day, the day of Friday prayers, Wael Ghanem did not speak. He was not allowed to speak. Instead, the agenda had been preempted by the Muslim Brotherhood, who, though caught flat-footed by the initial protests, soon gathered their strength to try to direct the revolution to their ends. Instead of Wael Ghanem, the Muslim Brotherhood insisted that Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi speak to the million or so Egyptians in the square. Sheikh Qaradawi is likely the most dangerous man in the world today. A spiritual guide to the Muslim Brotherhood, Qaradawi credits Hassan al-Banna, the Islamist father of the Brotherhood, as having more influence over his life than any other man. Chased out of Egypt and excluded from entry into the United States, Qaradawi took himself to Qatar, established the most watched television show of its type in the entire Muslim world, a weekly address on Islamic law and religion. But Sheikh Qaradawi is no Fulton J. Sheen. This man, the most influential religious figure in all of Sunni Islam, issues fatwas that reek in violence and hate. Here's a sample, February 8, 2010. Quote, "Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. By means of all the things he did to them, even though the Jews exaggerated this issue, he managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hand of the believers." January 28, 2009, on Al Jazeera. "O Allah, take this oppressive Jewish Zionist band of people. Do not spare a single one of them, O Allah. Count their numbers and kill them, down to the very last one." Most significantly, Sheikh Qaradawi has changed the Sharia to enable Islamists to make war on the West from within. Under the classical Sharia, a Muslim should not reside in the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, referring to the area of the world that's not controlled by Islam. The Muslim may travel through the Dar al-Harb, be a trader or a visitor, but he is not to live under a government that is not Islamic. What Qaradawi has done is to develop the doctrine of the transferred Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, whereby immigrants in Western countries separate themselves from the law and society of their hosts and establish the Sharia as a rule for their own communities. His form of Sharia, Qaradawi's form of Sharia, the one from the most listened to religious scholar in the Sunni world, counsels Muslims in the West not to be immigrants, but colonizers. So in France today, there are an estimated 750 no-go zones in the country, where police and even firefighters do not enter, and the community regulates its internal affairs according to the Sharia. In England, there are 5 formal Sharia courts, allowed to make final judgments under the English Arbitration Act, and there are also over 80 informal Sharia courts that seek to dissolve disputes among Muslims according to Sharia law. This famously includes domestic abuse cases. So according to the Daily Mail, there are a number of domestic abuse cases reported to the police. The Muslim elders in the community, however, prevailed upon the wife to seek reconciliation and advice in a hearing before the elders. In each case, the wife withdrew the complaint, and the police did not proceed with the prosecution. In response to these acts, this last June, Baroness Caroline Cox introduced a new bill in the House of Lords intended to outlaw the use of Sharia law where it conflicts with English law. In proposing the new bill, she said, "Equality under the law is a core value of British justice. My bill seeks to preserve that standard. My bill seeks to stop parallel legal or quasi-legal systems taking root in our nation. Through these proposals," she went on, "I want to make it perfectly clear in the law that discrimination against women shall not be allowed within arbitration. I am deeply concerned about Muslim women how they are treated by Sharia courts." What is happening in England and France is replicated throughout Europe, in Holland, Denmark, and Sweden. In Rome recently, there was a mass public prayer event in front of the Victor Emmanuel Monument, the symbol of Italian nationhood. It was designed to show that the Muslims bow to a different authority. A Sharia court has been established in Antwerp by a group called Sharia for Belgium, whose avowed purpose is, quote, "to create a parallel Islamic legal system in Belgium in order to challenge the state's authority as enforcer of the civil law protections guaranteed by the Belgian Constitution." In Brussels, Muslim youth no longer attend the mosques that their Turkish and Moroccan parents did, the moderate mosques. Instead, they are gravitating toward radical imams. The momentum towards a more radical Sharia is evident and dismaying. The Memory Site reports that the global Sharia movement, designed explicitly to undermine Western law, is growing and coordinating itself within Western states. A majority of Muslims in most Muslim states say, according to Pew Research, that they want to live under a regime that incorporates Sharia. No majority in any Muslim state, according to Pew Research, believes that the Arabs carried out the 9/11 attacks. Most Islamic states incorporate the Sharia in their law in a number of ways. Many have mixed legal systems in which the Sharia rules domestic relations or sometimes property law. Some state that the Sharia is a source or the source of all legislation in the country. Some constitutions declare that no legislation contrary to the Sharia will be valid, and some are explicitly based upon the Sharia. Sooner or later, these cases are going to come to our courts through these other legal systems. How did it come this way? How did the Sharia change from the moderate classical Sharia to what it is now? Well, let me take you on a 5-minute tour of Islamic history. You ready? All right, get on board. During the first 3 centuries of Islam, there were 2 great identity crises going on. One political, one theological, and philosophical. The political one was fought over who would be the legitimate successor, the Caliph, to Muhammad. And that's the source of the Sunni-Shia split that we all know about. But in each case, the kind of regime that would succeed would be an imperial regime. There was no doubt about that. Not a decentralized one except by happenstance, but an intentionally centralized imperial regime. At the same time, there was a 3-century battle as to what the identity of Islam would be. There were 3 or 4 major parties fighting about it. One party, the Kharijites, thought that a true Muslim is only a Muslim so long as he practices perfect Islam. And if he doesn't practice perfect Islam, he is an apostate and should be killed. Another, the Murjites, found that Muslims should be all equal, and they should accept any caliph that's put over them, and they should be that no caliphate was worth a war. But the 3rd and 4th parties are the ones that really mattered. There were 2 parties in the 8th and 9th centuries fighting over the identity of Islam. One were the legalists who eventually formed the Sharia. The second were a group called the Mu'taziliya. The Mu'taziliya were Islam's rationalists, very similar to the Thomistic scholastics in Christendom. They read the Greeks. They thought the Quran was an important piece of legislation, but that man possessed a God-given reason to find what the truth was. The Mu'taziliya, the rationalists, won the battle for the identity of Islam in the Caliphate of Al-Mamun. in 835 AD. But 50 years later, it was reversed, and a new caliph said that the legalists, the ulama, the Sharia people, had the real definition of what Islam was. And so Islam, after this battle, became identified with law, with God as command, not as God as person. And their only opposition were the Sufis, who saw God as a mystical presence with whom one could have a relationship. So the Sharia was formed by jurists under the shadow of the imperial government, under the protection of the imperial government, in a recognition by the imperial government, and the Sharia, therefore, was not going to oppose the imperial government. And thus, whenever the emperor decided, the caliph decided to push the Sharia aside in order to establish his own jurisdiction in criminal law, in the law of the market, he established a court called an equity court, just like the English did. The Qadi justices, the Sharia judges held that that was perfectly legitimate. So what you have coming through 1,000 years of Islamic history is you have a corpus of the Sharia, which is created by jurists, which is enforced only if the caliph says it's to be enforced, and which is agreed to by the ulama as being the caliph's decision. I repeat that. Constitutionally, it was perfectly legitimate, according to the terms of the Sharia, for the caliph to put the Sharia aside and establish state law instead. And every Islamic empire did that. Every modern Islamic state, except the radical ones such as Iran and the Sudan and Saudi Arabia, have a mixed legal system. Perfectly Islamic. What has changed? What has changed is that after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the Salafist movement grabbed a hold of the idea of the identity of Islam should be more like it was with the Kharijites, the early Islamic sect, who held that if you didn't practice Islam perfectly, you were an apostate. And they made war on all the Muslim states for not being perfect. These people, many of whom were Marxist trained, combined the Western notion of a monopoly of force in the state with their version of the Sharia. Then they changed the substance of the Sharia so that they could enforce the Sharia without the Sharia's protections. Do you know in the Sharia torture is not allowed? Torture is allowed under the radical version of the Sharia. Under the original Sharia, innocents could not be killed during warfare. Today, innocents are killed precisely because they are innocent. This is the Sharia that is threatening to turn Islam from a religion to a political ideology, threatening to turn a system of beliefs, of a relationship, of an idea of what is righteous living before God, into an ideology in which is at the service of a vanguard, and they sometimes call it the vanguard, that tyrannizes over everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim, that doesn't believe in them. This is the ideology that Qaradawi is spreading in the European enclaves of Islam. This is the ideology that threatens to turn us into a civilizational conflict that we have not had before. That is why this form of the Sharia is an abomination to the history of Islam. This form of the Sharia is a threat to our civil liberties. This form changes a Muslim from a believer in Allah to an ideologue, apparatchik, for a totalitarian regime. And that's what we should be opposing and afraid of. Thank you.